Putting a stop to family violence. We ask the experts whether the conversation Rosie Batty started is in danger of stalling, and what more can be done to support victims and challenge perpetrators. And joining me on this evening's panel, domestic violence survivor Lisa McAdams, who now advises businesses on domestic violence awareness. Welcome. The head of the Muslim Women's Association, Maha Abdo, a regular on this panel who helps run the Linking Hearts Multicultural Family Support Service in Western Sydney. In Brisbane, family therapist Dave Burck, and in Melbourne, Ways Frankston's Women's Services Coordinator Shirley Slan. Welcome all, and you two are welcome to join us on Twitter. If you use the hashtag The Drum, as well as on Facebook, where the program is streaming live right now. Now, it's been nearly 2 years since former Australian of the Year Rosie Batty put domestic violence on the national agenda.
No matter where you live, family violence exists in every pocket of every neighbourhood. It does not discriminate, and it is across all sections of our society.
We've all heard at least some of the statistics on this topic, but that doesn't make them any less confronting. A monitoring project called Counting Dead Women estimates that 59 women have died as a result of violence across Australia so far this year. According to the Bureau of Statistics, around 1 in 6 women has experienced violence from a current or former partner, as have around 1 in 19 men. And 1 in 4 women has experienced emotional abuse, along with 1 in 7 men. Now, largely thanks to Rosie Batty, we spent a year intensely debating domestic violence, but the attempt to find ways to combat it has just begun. And there are still concerns it's underreported. In 2012, the ABS found 80% of women and 95% of men who'd experienced violence at the hands of their current partner had never contacted police. Statistics in this area can be difficult to interpret due to a lack of accurate, consistent national data. But in any case, is there a risk we focus too much on the numbers and not on what actually works, as well as what domestic violence actually looks like?
Family terrorism is on our neighbourhoods and poses more risk to our local communities than the terrorism we are terrified of from overseas. We have to readjust our priorities.
And the question is, I suppose, Maha, did we readjust our priorities? And you've worked in this area for decades. What do you think happened as a consequence of that intense media scrutiny and discussion on the subject of domestic violence?
I think it brought out the issue. The awareness is gone so far. A lot more people are now more aware of what domestic violence is, what are some of the boundaries that one person can overcome. Children are a lot more aware, and I think it's given men a little bit more awareness of their own actions as well, and what it means to respect women and overcome some of those issues that they couldn't deal with before. So awareness is one thing, but then action on the ground is something else.
So how have you seen that awareness play out then?
Because there's been an high increase number of referrals coming through from young women, from older women. We've got the different age groups now coming through and identifying as being victims of domestic violence and are aware of some of their rights, some of their responsibilities. But the services haven't increased on the ground.
Now, Shirley, you've worked in this area as well for the past 2 decades, and particularly in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I guess one question for you is what this has meant in the communities you've worked in, and if in fact, would there have been any difference in the debate if Rosie Batty were Indigenous?
I think before Rosie Batty spoke forward, like for so long and so often, women's and children's voices weren't being heard, and what happened was, with Rosie's voice, for some reason, the media did actually run with it, which was a fantastic, thing out of very difficult, harsh circumstances to show that domestic and family violence does impact on everybody. So services were actually relieved in the extent that finally media and the government were actually listening to what was actually happening. So through Rosie's voice, she was able to advocate for everyone else that has been speaking for a whole number of years in regards to domestic and family violence issues. Because domestic and family violence does not discriminate; it affects everyone, regardless of your culture or race.
Right, and I guess if I could put the question to you again as well, because I know that recently there's been some discussion about has there been sufficient debate about violence within Indigenous communities and why haven't, and some people saying in public forums that Aboriginal women have not been putting forward this argument. I guess the question would be, do you think there would have been a different response or different debate if Rosie Batty were Indigenous?
Look, to be completely honest, I don't think anyone would have listened if it was an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have had issues for a number of years, and there's been a number of reports around. I know in Queensland there was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander task force report on violence. So there's been women, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and men have been, talking about the issues for years. So I actually believe if it was an Aboriginal person, because unfortunately society does have the misunderstanding that it's normal for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have, domestic violence in their communities, and that's not the case at all. Yes, the statistics do show that it is quite high, but unfortunately, no one does seem to listen to rural remote communities. And
did you see any of the changes that Maha was referring to play out across those communities as well?
Yeah, I think originally people thought, has there been an increase in violence, because people were coming forward, but it was more of an awareness, I think, for people not to be ashamed, not to be embarrassed to come forward. But I still believe that our responses actually need to change in regards to looking at domestic and family violence, because if we just deal with the woman that's usually the victim of family violence, and we don't focus on the perpetrator's behaviour, then nothing's going to change, because, with perpetrators of violence, we call them perpetrators, but let's not forget that, these men are members of our families, they're friends, and it's the behaviour that choose. There's no bad or rotten person, but there should be services that are available to assist people to change their behaviour. Yes,
I really want to come back to that, because I know it's an important point that you make about perpetrators and also your work with the entire family in question there. But I want to bring Dave in now. Dave, what do you think occurred last year in the way we understand domestic violence, and do you think we do properly understand it now?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, but I think with Rosie Batty, I work in a program that is called ReNew. That's a joint program with Corinity and the Domestic Violence Action Center in Ipswich. And we were actually talking about this. It works with mothers and sons. And we were sort of talking about this in group before one of our groups started. And what we think is that it's really risen the awareness of domestic violence as a social problem, as a problem for the community. It's no longer it's a private matter for the family, that domestic violence is a problem that the community needs to gather around and help support. But the one thing is that with the awareness, there seems to be a lack of awareness of the long-lasting impacts of domestic violence. So what are the impacts for the family moving on from becoming safe? What are the impacts for the children and the women and the mothers years later? So that's sort of where the work needs to happen now, but it's really shifted the focus from a private family matter to more of a social problem, more of a community issue to tackle.
And does that misunderstanding or lack of comprehension occur, do you think, because we focus only on perhaps acts of violence and not the enduring consequences?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because in our group today, we talked about one of the parts of the groups is to rebuild the relationship between the son and mother who have witnessed violence, and now the son using violence against the mother. And we're going through all the impacts of domestic violence, and only one impact was the physical violence, and the rest was all impacts emotionally, trust, functioning at school, economic. And I think housing, I think a lot of those sort of secondary impacts, there needs to be more awareness of those impacts on the family and how those play out long term.
Okay, all right. And Lisa, if I can bring you in, as someone who has survived violence, family violence, did you watch the debates unfolding over the last couple of years and go, oh, thank goodness we're talking about this? Or did you also have some moments of discomfort because there might be things we're still getting wrong?
My big thing was, expanding the conversation, because like David just said, it is very, very complicated. It's not an easy thing to solve. And people going, oh, you've left, or why didn't you leave? These answers are there. And it's why I'm passionate about corporate, because if you can keep people in work, the hardest bit to get over is actually the financial impact. And once you haven't got that, I mean, there's programs you can go on, but you're dealing with poverty. So for me, the conversation is where we are now. We all need to say, this is a whole community issue, and you can't ignore part of the community and expect to solve it, because it affects every single person. And it's not, it's in the Muslim community, but it's also at our CEO level.
And what have you experienced working with corporations, and what have you found about how it's understood in a workplace?
What surprised me most about going into corporate, I knew, and I work with very big corporates, I knew they would care about the bottom line. I knew they would get that it was impacting in productivity. Now it's in their awareness. But what I didn't expect is just how much they care. And genuinely care. They can see what is happening. They want their customers, they want their staff to feel safe. They want to lessen the impacts. And that, for me, coming from a corporate background, realising the corporate social responsibility shift, that these big corporates do care. And I think if corporates can come on board, we can get community on board, and we can get government, federal and state on board, then we've got a chance. I mean, New South Wales is starting to look at what can we do for perpetrators? How do we use technology? Technical abuse is becoming a big thing. So how do we use that same technology to help, to educate, to grow what we've got? But we cannot solve it on just dealing with the victim, because it's like in the schoolyard, just dealing with the bullied wouldn't solve the issue. And the perpetrator probably comes from somewhere where they need help as well, and they need help to change. And this might not be, but just demonising it isn't going to solve this problem. We need to get to where everybody's saying, let's solve this, let's come together.
That's true.
Do you think there has been a shift then to understanding that we need to be thinking about a perpetrator? There has been a lot of discussion of it.
Julie, I think the thing is, because we need to move away from the labelling. Because in the past, you labelled the domestic violence victim as a poor old lady with so many children, and it was you could sort of target a particular group. Now there's more awareness to know that domestic violence can really affect those in the highest of positions in corporate organisations, those that are at different levels of economic level. So when we're talking about the responsibility of who is to be working together, we need to look at it from a holistic approach. Dealing with domestic violence is not a woman's problem, and it's not a man's problem. It is a whole of society responsibility. And I think when we look at responsibility, we all need to own a bit of that. And that is inclusive of businesses, local, national, international businesses, because it is about your own people that work with you sometimes. And it saves a lot of money when we're able to help in the early intervention stages.
Okay, now, I mean, another matter when you're dealing with corporations is the question of family leave, of domestic violence leave. And do you think that has become significant? And the reason I ask this is because I know that just this week we heard Federal Employment Minister Michaelia Cash had cancelled a planned meeting with her state counterparts, saying there were no matters requiring ministerial decision. But the Victorian government and a peak domestic violence support group say the meeting was finally a chance to talk about national standards for family violence leave. And we know that Michaelia Cash has in the past said that this will discourage employers from employing women.
Well, I was, as a businesswoman, disappointed that corporates and state governments are left to lead the charge on this. Again, the federal government is talking the talk but not walking the walk. And as a survivor, I was like, what? After all the conversations we've had. And what I would say to her is, if you're with a very, very controlling man, and you get 4 weeks leave and sick leave and all of those things, and he watches your every move, what of those days do you have where he doesn't know where you are? If you offered someone working leave where they can still go to work, access the phone, the computers, but he doesn't know they're not at work, or she doesn't know they're at work, that's a whole different ballgame. To say it's not necessary, I don't get it. Having worked in corporate, and I was lucky, I had a very supportive boss, and I was given those opportunities, and I wouldn't be sitting here now if I hadn't been given those opportunities. So one, I don't understand where she come from saying it's not necessary, and two, why she thinks as a Minister for Women she doesn't need to be there. I can't get that thinking.
Is she? You're saying she's talking the talk but not walking the walk. Is she talking the talk?
I think the federal government are talking.
I actually think
Shirley.
the government need to start focusing on what's really happening with real people down, on the ground that are living and in communities. Yes, it's good to focus on corporate, but let's if you look at our statistics and so forth, there's a lot of people that aren't corporate that are just experiencing and being affected by domestic and family violence. So I'd really like seeing the dollars being put into something that's actually really useful, that is going to make a difference to normal, everyday, average people.
Right. Well, I think probably the most important question on this when it comes to tackling family violence is, of course, what works. We know the federal government is halfway through implementing a 12-year plan to reduce violence against women and children. But despite the hundreds of millions of dollars being spent, those on the front line, as we're hearing tonight, are still reporting funding shortfalls in key areas like legal services and shelters, and say existing services can't keep up with increased demand. Dave, you are nodding in agreement.
Yeah, I was thinking when you were saying that, and one of the things with services for us is we were lucky for the Queensland government here helped fund the ReNew program, which is an early intervention that we're doing here, working with children and mothers together, where children have witnessed domestic violence, are using violence in the home, and working with mothers. And the goal there is to do an early intervention program, because so many programs, and people are talking about perpetrators, so many programs and services like you're talking about happen down the line after there's already been a domestic violence order or police involvement. And what we want to try and do is, if the sons are using violence in the home now against the mother, we're trying to get in there now and help rebuild that relationship to reduce the risk of violence later on.
Right.
And I think
now this is a world first program, isn't it? It's being, this is a world first global trial. Do you have evidence that this approach works?
Well, as a world first program, we're sort of laying the foundation for other programs to follow. I guess it's based off of evidence around attachment, trauma, and DV perpetrator programs. So it's sort of bringing in the best practices of those and combining them. Because what we want to do, and what people have said, is if you just work with one party in isolation, you're not going to get anywhere. And then it goes back to that awareness of DV as a complex issue. And a lot of focus is on the event and trying to work on complexity.
I think I fully agree with that program, but I think we need to start thinking innovatively. We need to start thinking, doing things differently, so that we can actually, get the right outcome that we want to get, different outcomes. Because if we're looking at a holistic approach, we need to bring in the men in this. The perpetrators have to start coming into the programs. I think, the government has been consulting over the last year. They've been having roundtables, and I've been in some of those roundtables, and the same issues have been raised over and over again. So it's so important that I agree. We need to look at the grassroots level stuff as well.
So what's that going to look like? Will it mean that women who are victims of domestic violence will stay in the home, for example?
Well, that's the best program. There are programs at the moment that run in New South Wales, and they've been working amazingly well, where you, instead of picking the mum and the children out in the middle of the night and then leaving them, taking them and plucking them out, you will keep them home. It's stay home and be safe and supported. But at the moment, there are no programs to support the perpetrator. So there's no case management approach. What I'd like to see is that whilst we keep the mother and the children at home, supported, case managed, we should do the same for the perpetrator so that we're not having to deal with the stalkers, the one that's left out in the, in the car park waiting to pounce on something. So if we're really serious about nipping this in the bud, looking at early intervention, is we've got to really look at a holistic approach to family violence.
Let's also be clear
Shirley,
that, I was going to say, let's also be clear that for women and children to remain in the home, they've got to feel safe to stay in the home.
Yes.
So we can have all the dollars under the sun.
Yeah.
And before, when we were talking about family violence, about about sons being abusive towards their mothers, we know this, but statistics show that the highest form of domestic and family violence is intimate spousal relationship between a man and a woman, and those dynamics are different between a mother and a son. And I know how difficult it is, like for a mother to for that relationship difference in regards to reporting violence against a son and so forth. So I think quite often all these relationships are stuck under the one umbrella, I guess, and those relationships are different. Yes, it is violence, but let's be quite clear that our statistics at the moment are showing that it's women and children, women with their partners in intimate spousal relationships that are losing their lives. You can see in the media where quite often people will say that why does she stay, why doesn't she leave? But if she does leave, that's when she's at her biggest risk.
Yes, Lisa.
I think we've got things like what David's doing is early intervention, because okay, my abuse was in my marriage, but if my son isn't retaught, if the sons aren't retaught, they then go on to be perpetrators in their marriage. But I think we do need that sort of thing. And we do need education, we need awareness, but not at the expense of refuges, of legal aid services, of all the things like staying in your home's fine, but for the amount of women we do we have an alternative? So you can't say, let's make it better for the next generation without realising this generation is in crisis and still needs the crisis care.
Shirley, what do you think works? I know you do a lot of work with the entire families when you talk about a holistic approach. What has your experience shown you is actually effective?
My experience is what has shown me is that we do need to teach our children from a young age like about healthy relationships, but we also need to actually work with the men that are committing violence. If we don't, we're just going to band-aid solution. If we look, yes, it's more on the front, on the in the media and so forth now that family violence is a major issue, but we actually have to look at changing the behaviour. That we talk about government and everyone talks about accountability, but what's the actual meaning behind accountability? Because if it's about increasing penalty rates and laws, it shows that prison doesn't work. Yes, we know that jail, sometimes has to be used, but that should be the last point of call, not the first point of call. So I believe it's about trying to work with the men to educate the men about their behaviour, but giving them that first opportunity, I guess. Like if we look, every communities may not all have like services put in place to assist, but there's always someone getting in trouble with the legal system or so forth. So if they're able to implement plans that a person is to attend an education program or talk to someone, because not everyone's got a men's behaviour change program, and really there's not enough research around whether they actually do work at the moment. But I think it's working with the men, talking to the women about their options, what's available, and I think if we focus on with the whole family, if we focus on the effects of domestic and family violence on children, I think we'll get a breakthrough, because regardless of whether you're a perpetrator of violence or a victim, children are the main common denominator in regards to both parents wanting to look after the children. So I think if we go from the angle, the impact that violence has on children as well as the whole family, and that yes, their behaviour is against the law. However, we want to work with you about changing your behaviour, and if you don't, then of course there's the laws in place and we have to do whatever, but we have to try to look at breaking that cycle.
Look, I agree with you, Shirley. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. I think, but from what I'm saying is that one size doesn't fit all, and we need to be aware of that. And exactly what you're saying, the early intervention stuff, working with the men, working with the perpetrators, and then it's really not just about changing behaviour of the today. It's about role modelling that. And I know the great work that you're doing, and here with the Linking Hearts program that we're doing in the multicultural sphere. you know, there's so much goodwill out there and so many good practices that have been done that we need to look at it. We need to really map out and see what's really happening out there. There's a lot of good. And so to take out the best of everything and realise, you know, that together we can make a difference, and the early intervention, the prevention stuff, but you need to look at the affordable housing stuff as well.
This is the subject, and one of the reasons we're talking about it tonight is because as our show goes to air, federal, state and territory leaders are preparing to meet in Brisbane for a major summit on exactly this subject. Headed by Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk, the summit will look at the effect of domestic violence on children, what role technology plays in abuse, and how we can change perpetrator behaviour. Now, if the panellists had one message for those attending tomorrow's meeting, what would it be? Dave, I'm starting with you.
I guess my message would be to really keep in mind the complexity of domestic violence and the long-lasting impact. I mean, the impact to the children's and women's sense of safety, financial impact, housing impact, ability to have work, and then children, ability to have healthy relationships in the future, and really looking long-term as opposed to short-term, more immediate solutions. Look to these long-term plans.
Lisa, what would you say?
I think from where I stand, the federal government, state government and businesses have to work with the communities, and everybody's getting something right. We need to all be putting on the table and being honest, saying we got that wrong, but we need to get to the stage where we're all saying we all matter. We're all in this together, whether you're a perpetrator, a victim, male, female, Muslim. We all need to come and say, we all want this fixed. We're all on the same side, and let's discuss it and let's accept that this is complicated. And I think anyone will agree, once you're in this area, and I lived it for nearly 4 decades as a child and an adult, I still hear things and find out things that I go, whoa. So they've got to go in, not with one of their, let's just put money in this area or this area, with a complex plan for a complex problem.
It is complex. I know it's difficult to distill, but Shirley, what would you say?
I believe continue to fund services for women and children, but start funding services to work with men that commit family violence, because unless we work with the men that are using violence, nothing's going to change.
Right. Okay, and with the families as well, I'm guessing you're suggesting. How is it, do you think, in the work that you've done, how do you actually change the attitudes of the men?
By treating them with respect. It's the behaviour that's used, and about talking to them about the impacts of their behaviour, using the law, like enforce the laws in regards to maybe giving them that first step forward in regards to wanting to change their behaviour, like their behaviour isn't acceptable, but they are accountable for their behaviour, but looking at the big picture impact of what actually happens. So I honestly believe that the current system about higher incarceration rates, when you look at those, the highest people that are being incarcerated are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Our jails are getting full. Getting bigger jails isn't going to make a difference. Jails aren't about rehabilitation. Unless you've been in jail for a long time, you won't get a program or a course. So I believe about doing rehabilitation before it actually gets to that stage. But depending on what the situation is, I know that sometimes, you know, jail is the first point of call, but I reckon let's focus more on a rehabilitation side of things and a prevention side of things by actually focusing on children. I can remember when I first started in the sector many years ago, I went to a community and there was a small child. One of the teachers said this little boy in grade 1 hit this girl, and she said, "Oh, look, you know, why did you hit her?" And he said, "It's okay, miss. She's my woman." You know, so
Nice.
it's about educating.
Ingrained.
Our children are watching us, and it's about it's about teaching at a very young age. But I still believe in all my heart that if we focus on the effects on children and also what they're doing to their families, and looking at the underlying issues.
Okay. Yes. Now, Maha, what would you say? And I know that funding has been important to you as well. Like, how much do you need? Better targeted funding or more of it?
I think funding is one thing, but we need to look at as well what has been working and not to throw everything out. When we do reforms, not to sort of throw out the last 35 years in that sector. To actually bring it forward, look at what's worked, and understand and know that the early intervention programs can be done in parallel to what we're working with in crisis, because we still need more funding for crisis intervention. For 24-hour service accommodation for those that need it on weekends and after hours. So we can't just have one size and say 9 to 5. Domestic violence doesn't take place from 9 to 5 sometimes. So we need to have those specialist services recognised and supported. And I must say, that New South Wales government at the moment has actually putting in some money in the Western Sydney area to provide a 24-hour support, and we're seeing how that goes, and that's measured at the moment. We'll evaluate that later on.
Okay, we're going to have to end there now for the drum. Thanks so much to our panel, all of whom are doing such important work in this area. Lisa McAdams, Maha Abdo, Dave Burck and Shirley Sland. Tomorrow we'll bring you an update on the COAG Domestic Violence Summit, and former Disability Discrimination Commissioner Graham Innes joins the panel. We'll see you then.